Some of you also associate me with being some of you may associate me with being a general pain in the ass too. But that's okay, I'm not as much anymore. I do dad jokes, but we're not going to start with that today. All right, well, thank you for coming, Jason. Great presentation to start off the day. We're going to follow it up talking about a topic that I think is really, really important, it's valuable. It's around the differences between brand and performance, and are they actually parts and parcel of the same thing? Steve mentioned I've been writing for MediaPost for 24 years. 23 years ago, I started writing about brand response, which is the combination of the two. And the three lovely people up here next to me had a great conversation with this just earlier last week about what this all means. So what I'm going to do first is let them introduce themselves. We're going to just go right down the line. And then I got to start out with a question. But like the questions that I prepared, we may not even get to because this topic is that juicy. So you want to get started?
Yeah. Hey, all. I'm Mack Magner. I'm Director of Strategy and Planning at Goodway Group. I am actually based locally here in Austin, Texas.
Hi.
Go ahead. I bet it works now.
Yeah. Jason Lim, EssenceMediacom Chief Planning Officer based in New York.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeanne Jennings. Thank you. SVP Group Director Media at McCann Health Engagement. We're an IPG Health network.
All right, so brand versus performance. And Jeanne, we're going to start with you all the way down because we're the reverse order of where we just started. But the conversation that we had the other day, just to kick this off, was are brand and performance just different stages of the measurement throughout the customer funnel? Are some of them leading indicators of what you're trying to generate later on in the performance journey? Are they the lagging indicators of what was started out when you start thinking about awareness? Like, how do brand and performance metrics intertwine?
That's a great question. I feel like there are absolutely some leading performance indicators and lagging indicators, and awareness, tracking brand awareness and brand equity. These are more of the lagging ones, right? Performance, as we know it, those more kind of like quicker measures, right? Like those are more of the kind of like more short term. You see the performance more quickly. Do they intertwine? Yes, at some point, but it's not going to be in like a 2-week or even like a month time frame, right? Mm-hmm. There's sometimes, and I've heard this from some of our clients, and a couple of clients have said, our engagement is great and our clicks are great, whatever they're measuring for like a short term, but our awareness sucks. Mm-hmm. The brand awareness is not there. They're still trying to make people aware of who they are, what they do, how effective they are, what their benefit is. And it's, a challenge for them. And so I think that, in terms of how we measure, there needs to be an investment in, kind of bridging that gap and having not separate campaigns, but really complementary initiatives so that you can see your short-term performance and also those long-term awareness and brand equity goals.
Jason?
Sure. I think the question is a little misleading, and only because I don't think it's just about the measurement. The measurement is part of the outcome, certainly, but brand and performance reside on the same continuum, but play different roles. And the way I like to think of it is some people talk about short-term and long-term effects. Mm-hmm. And long-term indicates like brand, I have to wait for brand. It's going to be years before I see any kind of return on that investment. And the reality is brand does performance immediately. It's a lasting effect, not a long-term effect. And that's one of the things that people don't really calibrate into their measurement either. In that when you look at brand investments, and Jason Acker just did a great analysis around this, a lot of that work was brand-oriented work, meaning an emotional structure, some sort of memory guide, but it's not like it was divorced of performance. There was sales, there was demand that was coming off of that, and that's exactly what brand should do, or what good brand should do. So it's not a performance versus brand. It's always a brand and performance. It's those two things go hand in hand. Now, mind you, there are realities to the specific channels and the messages and the intent, and clearly there's a difference in terms of the way in which we would measure it, not just the tools that we would use, but the time frames that we would use. So there are nuances, but I think the more we talk about it as a versus, it kind of diminishes the impact of both to a certain extent.
Matt?
Yeah, I would kind of echo all of that, and I think it's going to depend on the brand too, right? Like some brands have a ton of brand awareness already, and they can kind of capitalize on that, and maybe their allocation is more geared towards performance because they have that awareness to capitalize on from previous. Versus if you're a brand that's new and starting out, you probably need to push more into awareness from the start. And I think, what I think y'all have both said is measurement is kind of the key to unlocking what that allocation should be, right? Because you don't get one without the other. You can't just show conversion ads all the time and expect that someone's first exposure to a brand, then they're going to make a purchase or sign up for something, right? And if you only run awareness, eventually you're going to not be able to convert people because you're not bringing them down the funnel. And so I think, there's a lot of change going on as far as how we measure and ensure that not only those lasting and the long-term versus the short-term effects, but like what's also the lead and lag between pushing awareness into market and then how that's then going to affect your bottom funnel metrics. Like is that a month? Is that 2 months? Is it a quarter? And I think we're starting to dig at those things through things like MMM, but even that is, can be a 3 to 6 month lag time on that measurement. So
I want to come back to MMM in a minute, but let's ask a question of the audience and then tailor it back to you. How many people have ever bought anything on either Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok? Okay. All three of you have. Does context matter? Because a lot of people buy stuff in that environment and it's no branded content or no branded product. Right? You're buying a product in many cases because of an impulse. And I would argue that most of those products, my kids buy it regularly, unfortunately. There is no brand there. It's just a product that at the moment you see it and you're like, I could use that. So is it possible that the context actually helps to drive whether or not the brand is important? Anybody, shoot.
Sure. I'll go twofold on that. Context is always important in my mind, so it does play a substantial role. But many of the products that we see in social avenues that are immediately clicked, that you don't have any kind of brand equity with, I would argue are low purchase items.
Low cost.
Yeah. No one's buying a car off of that ad, right? It's like, if I want to do a dating app or if I want to do some no-cost barrier entry, absolutely. But I don't think the higher considered purchases are happening within that dynamic. And part of that is the ease of the purchase. It's the immediacy of it. And I'd relate this similar to kind of what we saw with COVID. Everyone has a brand preference until that brand isn't available. And there's another purchase that happens invariably accordingly. So whether it be toilet paper, soda, or otherwise, it's a function of the availability just as much as that brand affinity in that moment.
Yeah, definitely have done the impulse buys. And especially, I'd say, there are opportune moments when, for example, on Instagram, when you're kind of scrolling and if you're like me, you look at influencers who may be, having content on fashion or, hair or makeup. And of course, after like a certain amount of time, you're scrolling, right? Like a product that is related to the context, right? Of what you're looking at comes up. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh, that looks interesting or looks fun or, and it's not, it's within the kind of like a price point of an acceptable price point. Like it's not a Mercedes-Benz, of course. Right. So, so I go and buy and luckily I haven't regretted a purchase.
You're the one.
Yeah, they're functional, they work and it's okay.
Mack?
Yeah. And I think I would add on to that as someone that's also made those like kind of in the moment purchases. I couldn't tell you any of those brands that I purchase from, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or Instagram, when I'm like, oh yeah, I need this thing that's really easy, low hanging fruit to buy. I've bought it in that moment and it may have served me well, but I couldn't tell you what those brands are, right?
Yeah.
Which I think, to Jason, your point earlier, is an issue for that brand in the long term, right? Because they, in theory, would want someone to come back again, or at some level turn into a loyal member and an advocate for that brand and go submit reviews or things like that. And so I think there is a level of need for storytelling throughout the funnel, so that when someone does purchase, they are familiar with the brand. That brand still has a lasting impact with them. So even though that relationship, may end there for now, we would want them to be familiar enough with the brand to come back later, versus I think the situation we're describing does not create a relationship to do that.
Yeah. What the three of you are hitting on right now is, if you look back at the topic, right, hearts, minds, and action, bridging the gap between brands and performance, right? Part of those bridges are built on the context of the situation, the price of the product, whether it's an impulse buy or a considered purchase, whether or not you need somebody to be buying this product on a repetitive basis or not, or to create loyalty, et cetera. So there are actually elements you can identify in the planning process that help you determine how important brand is going to be versus performance. So that brings you to another question, which is, can you have great performance without a brand, and can you have great brand without great performance?
I'd say that's relative to scale. If you are a smaller advertiser or a smaller brand, good performance can look very different than a larger brand, right? So it's relative to the portion of your overall revenue, I would argue. But I don't think I know of a case where you have great, exceptional performance without a strong brand, or at least not one that resides or persists over time. And I think that's one of the critical criteria is, again, it operates on a spectrum. One does lead into the other, and there's a lasting effect that brand provides, and so invariably your performance gets better over time.
There is one interesting example that I'll ask randomly. Does anybody remember the wine brand Charles Shaw? For a while it was called $2 Chuck.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, it was sold at Trader Joe's. Sold off the shelves. Nobody knows what Charles Shaw is. But $2 Chuck, everybody remembers that, and it sold off the shelves. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but they sold out. So there's some weird examples, and I think that digital media might actually perpetuate some of that strangeness.
Yeah, and I think that's what I would call the exception, not the rule, right? And I think you're much more likely to have great brand without good performance than you are to have great performance without good brand, kind of to what you're talking about. Because I think, you can create this amazing brand, and then at the end of the day, people, maybe not want to buy it, right? But on the flip side, I think performance there's a cap on it, right? Like there's a ceiling without pushing brand, and eventually that audience of whether it's retargeting or site visitors, or even if you're doing prospecting at the bottom of the funnel, there's a cap on that without having push people from the top of the funnel down to search, to social, things like that. So I could see it working in the way that you have great brand with not great performance, but I don't think that I've seen a lot of examples of it going the other way.
Jeanne,
I
comment?
agree. You could have a great brand and high awareness for your brand, but there are factors sometimes that consumers that happen to consumers that may result in not in lack of performance. So, for example, they have positive view of your brand, but they're kind of loyal to another brand. So, even though they've been loyal maybe for the competitor brand, your competitor, for years, but they still see you as, it's a nice brand, positive brand. There's a lot of equity there, but they could be loyal to something else. Maybe a price point difference. That's another factor. So things like that have to be considered as well.
Okay, so we're in the Planning and Buying Insider Summit. Let's talk about planning and buying just for a second. When you're putting together a recommendation for a brand you work on, or the brand that you specifically are focused on, at where in the stage of planning are you discussing the brand versus the performance metrics? Or ultimately, is the brand a stepping stone to get to performance of sales, revenue, whatever it might be. How are you bringing up these 2 points of conversation in the strategic planning process? Mack, you're closest.
So there are a couple of ways that we do it. Number one, it's rarely a conversation around just the brand or performance in terms of the construct. More often than not, you always start with the audience. Some audiences are more familiar with the brand, other audiences are not. And so when you identify source of growth, it's not a media mechanism that buys anything, it's people. So you try to ground it within that human insight in some capacity or the audiences. Beyond that, there's gap analyses. One of the quotes that lingers with me is the CMO of Monster a few years ago said, "We lost a generation because we stopped focusing on brand." And effectively, they moved for like a decade. They migrated a lot of their advertising specifically towards performance. And he said, "We lost a generation." And that stayed with me for a bit because it's a meaningful outcome. And people still remember what that brand is, certainly, but I would argue that the relevancy is probably declined relative specifically against certain audiences. It's not about the metric per se, about whether or not someone is high in awareness. People still remember Jelly Green Giant and things of that nature, right? It's whether or not that means the same thing that it did then, and that there's a causal element around a purchase behavior associated with it. So a long way of answering that question was, no, performance brand inherently isn't the construct. I think that's part of the outcome that you get to, but the inputs are more predicated around where they sit within the relevancy and how the audiences perceive them.
We're a healthcare advertising agency, and of course, all our clients are in healthcare, pharma, biotech. And so most of the time, we support our clients' brand launches. Yeah. So it's a new drug is coming, a new treatment is coming. We support them on brand launches. Naturally, the goal is we want to make people aware of the new treatment is coming. So brand awareness is the initial goal, going into the planning and the buying. When we present our media recommendations, of course we don't just stop at our goal is brand awareness, but we also, as maybe a funnel might dictate, what are those kind of like bottom of the funnel metrics that we could provide, like maybe not just sales, maybe not sales just yet, because that's more long-term, right? So more immediate metrics like site engagements or engagement with content on the site. But yeah, so with this, supporting the brand launches also means getting the consumers or the target audiences to get there to the engagement parts, to the conversion parts.
Yeah. But so is it almost safe to say that in pharma and potentially in other categories of marketing and branding, you can start with building a brand, but you're ultimately going to always show up at revenue, sales, performance, right? Because otherwise, the average tenure of a CMO for a while was 2, maybe 3 years, and the halls are littered with CMOs being thrown out the door saying, "I built a great brand, though."
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if it's not performing, then at some level, it's like, who cares, right? Yeah. And I think to kind of couple that with the question you asked, like, we're talking about those things in the same breath because we have to. And I think to echo everything, Jason, you said, like that, everything Jason said is kind of where it starts. And one thing that we've started to be really pointed about when we get to like very nitty gritty, the end of like a strategy or like the plan of a deck, is we start to create these outcomes blueprints of like, here's each stage of the funnel and here's what we're measuring and here's how those actually lead from one into the other. And, we've moved away, right, as an industry from measuring click-through rate as an indicator of performance, right? And so we're starting to look at a lot more things like, hey, has our demand on search gone up because of the CTV that we've pushed into the market, right? And not only that, but everyone loves to talk about sales and revenue and ROAS, right? And so I think it's funny when ROAS goes up or conversion rate goes up, it's like, oh, well, search is doing great. And it's like, well, yeah, that didn't happen in a vacuum though, right? Like, it's because CTV and audio and video and social are live too, and we're pushing those things. And so I think there's a really important need to understand how awareness is also impacting the revenue at the bottom of the funnel, right? Because it's not just happening in a vacuum on search and social.
Yeah. I want to come back to the media mix model. We'll go to regular questions from everybody else in a minute, but does media mix modeling, is it a viable option to solve and determine what is the bridge between brand and performance? Because I know it takes a long time, it takes an obscene amount of data, and also it takes a lot of patience, which, let's be honest, between agency and brand, there's not always that much patience. Is it a potential way to solve for the understanding the bridge between the two?
I think yes. And as far as right now, I feel like in focus group of 1, it's the best we have to understand, like, how is awareness actually affecting performance, right? But the hard part is you're looking at a 3 or 6 month lag. Mm-hmm. So if we're, Q4 is our big time of year, right? And then we're not understanding how our October awareness actually affected our December sales or our holiday sales until June of next year, like, that's kind of tough, right? Because now we've missed 6 months of planning and buying that we could have used that data for. Is it helpful for the following holiday season? Probably, but also we're now a year out from that data and things may have changed. So I think yes, but it's not the end all be all.
I would absolutely say that media mix modeling is probably the closest we've been towards getting to an accurate answer. I think as an industry, we misuse it. So we don't necessarily look at MMMs in the way in which they should be intended, particularly as it talks about closing the gap between performance and brand. One, rarely are there hierarchical models built, meaning looking at the actual contribution of consideration, awareness, or otherwise, looking at how baseline grows relative to the incremental. So those are aspects that rarely get analyzed within an MMM. They're used as an ROI metric, which is somewhat of a blunt instrument many times. The other is that there's an over-reliance on MMMs at times. I don't know if anyone knows who George Box is, but George Box is probably the father of econometric modeling. He's a statistician. And one of the things that he said was, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right?
That's a good point.
And that's exactly the way in which I think it should be ascribed, because media mix modeling is inherently a backward-looking tool, and our industry moves pretty fast. And so you have to take into account the cultural relevance, the milestones, as well as the new reach attainment that any channel would be able to provide. So it's one input, an important input, but I think it's misused if you are only prescriptively looking at an MMM.
I agree with Jason. But in our experience, though, as you pointed it out, Cory, that media mix modeling is requires a lot of patience and investment in time and money, and so we just, I think with in our world, our clients are just like, oh, we just can't do that. So we develop little proxies here and there. I will give you an example of we had worked on this a while back, an established brand. So an established brand came to us and said, our awareness is really low. So can you support us here? And so we set out to do an awareness campaign, and we also established our measurement approach, right? So everyone's in agreement. But within weeks, the client came to us and said, our sales are not impacted by our campaign. What's going on? I said, okay, let's take a step back. We agreed on having an awareness initiative and also a measurement approach to how we would get there. So I think it kind of just brings it back to reality and to the focus. And then something else happened during the course of the campaign, where they had to shut down the site because of there's like a something that they had to do on the back end, right? So they shut the site, their brand site, for a number of days, not a long time, maybe 3 days, and that actually affected their engagements. And so they came back again and said, "What's going on? Our engagements are down and our sales."
Surprise.
So you know, and I thought those are good insights to include and say, listen, as we're trying to bridge the gap between awareness and performance, right? Oh, but awareness is performance,
Yeah.
right?
It sounds like a super fun client to have worked on. Steve, you have some
Let's,
questions from the audience?
Yeah, let's grab a few questions before we break.
We got one down in the front. That's Joe.
I got him.
Hi, Joe Mandisi, MediaPost. We'll have two, but I'm going to go with one. So, you know, I showed a slide earlier in my intro about the fragmentation and atomization of media, but the corresponding stat is the fragmentation atomization of brands. So you know this number. In the 80s, there were 200 national brands using television. By the end of the 80s, there was 2,000 brands using cable TV. Today, there's over 12 million brands using TikTok, Instagram, et cetera. So is brand equity a luxury in that world? Or is those established major brands, Jolly Green Giant, don't have the luxury now to compete with the direct-to-consumer brand that's coming out tomorrow? Pharma's probably a unique category in itself, and super premium brands like Diageo too. But for the mainstream CPG-type brands, is this a nice-to-have brand equity? Because they're surviving, right?
I think brand equity, and I subscribe to a lot of the Ehrenberg Bass, Byron Sharp. I think it serves a specific purpose. It's a cheat sheet. So if you are familiar with any of Daniel Kahneman's work around System 1, System 2 processing, it plays exactly that role. It's easier. It makes it easier to make a decision and be confident in that decision. And as long as it continues to play that role, I think it's very valuable. I think it's one of the best tools that we have as marketers, as long as that memory structure persists along the lines of a positive affinity or otherwise. There's a lot of brands that come into play in and out of our lives, and this is one of the areas that Mack, you just mentioned there, where you might purchase something. Absolutely, that transaction may occur. Whether or not you build an association or an affinity for that brand where it persists, that's an absolutely different story. And most purchases aren't based on the high affinity people. It's not like, oh my God, I am such a subscriber to whatever product that I'm going to buy in and day out every day. Most purchases are the long tail. Most purchases are the random purchase that you made last week that you may or may not ever buy that again, but you certainly didn't buy it the week before that. And so that's part of where brand really sits. It's not where that core affinity that wears the t-shirt and the hat. It's this is shorthand. I know this brand. I trust this brand. I'm going to buy this brand. So I hope that answered the question.
We're going to have a roundtable at the end of the morning that's going to extend this conversation. I think that's exactly the right place for it because you guys raised some fascinating issues and dynamics here that I think are worth pursuing. Again, we'll have a roundtable at the end of the morning that drills into this. Cory, panel, I want to thank you guys very much.
Thank you.